Just wanted to show you the May pillow of the month. This one will be displayed in May. You should have already received this kit, but I thought I'd take today to show you how to go about laying it out. This pillow involves a lot of applique processes, and so I'm going to show you a couple, but I'm going to start out with quilting our background fabric. I know the kit says to quilt at the end, but Seth and I were talking and we thought it might be easier to quilt at the beginning. So what I did is I'm taking my background for my pillow front. I'm taking the wreath that your flowers are going to lay on, and I'm just kind of centering it on top of my background fabric. Taking a air erase marker, and I'm just going to put a couple of markings on here so I know about where I should stop quilting. My fear is I don't want to quilt the entire background for fear that you'll see those lines underneath my flowers. So I'm just going to do a few spots so I know where to quilt up to. And then I'm going to show you how to put a few lines on here so that we can use our walking foot guide and we can easily quilt this by ourselves. Trust me, if I'm willing to quilt it by myself, it's easy. I normally send everything out to have a long arm do it. Don't forget to mark a few of your center spots so that you know where to do your middle. Okay, now that I have that marked, I'm going to put that off to the side. I like to draw my crosshatch lines on a 45-degree angle. So the easiest way that I have found to do that is I just take my square of fabric and I fold one corner down, kind of crease it with my hand, and now I take my ruler, put it along that line, and I'm going to draw the mark. I'm going to draw one more line an inch apart because that's how far apart I decided I wanted my quilting. I'm going to draw one below my initial line and one above my initial line. That way when I first start doing this with my walking foot, I'll have a line to shoot on. Now I could go to my machine and I could quilt this entire direction and then come back and mark the other way. To save time, I'm going to mark both ways to start with. So again, I'm just taking that corner, I'm bringing it down, I'm finger pressing it, and I'm going to draw a couple of lines. I don't need to draw all my lines because my guide on my walking foot is going to help me with all the other lines. I'm going to take my pillow top. I took some muslin or some scrap fabric, a sheet of batting, and I'm going to put this pillow top on top of it. You'll notice my backing fabric and my batting are a little bit larger than my original one. Just going to take a couple of pins to hold it in place a little bit. You could also use 505 spray if you prefer that. That's fine. I'm just using some pins till I get a couple of rows of stitching going. So you may be saying, Chris, why did you mark where the wreath was? The reason why I marked where the wreath is going to end up is I want to stitch up to and maybe a stitch inside of my wreath placement line. Then I'm going to skip the middle of my wreath. I'm going to take a stitch right before I go out of my wreath again so that I can do the middle. I'm going to come in a stitch. I'm going to skip this whole area in here I'm going to start a stitch before I get outside of the wreath and continue on. Why am I doing that? I'm concerned that if I were to just run a line of quilting throughout the entire back of my fabric, that when I go to put my applique flowers on, you might see those channel lines. So by skipping this area where the wreath is going to cover, I will avoid having those channel placements. So now we're ready to quilt our background fabric. You'll notice I'm starting off my fabric on the batting and backing. I've increased my stitch length to 3 on the Bernina, which is a little bit larger than a normal stitch length. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch on that first line that we put in our quilt. And like I said before, I'm going to stitch 1 stitch into my wreath. Now, I'm just going to pick it up and I'm going to move it. It's okay that I have that long jump stitch there. It'll be hidden later. If it really drives you crazy, you can always cut it and bury the tails. I'm going to stitch a stitch or 2 before I come out of my wreath again. Quilting in the center of my pillow now. I'm going to stitch a stitch or 2 into my wreath, make a nice long tail, stitch 1 or 2 stitches to get out of my wreath. And I'm going to sew off my fabric again. Now what I like to do is I like to turn my fabric. I just continue sewing down that batting. Well, I have to stop and cut your threads and do it again. And I'm going to sew on that first line that I made before. You'll notice that by sewing off the end, coming down and stitching, my rows go opposite ways. That should help keep your fabric square. If you constantly sew the rows in the same direction, chances are you can warp it and your fabric will become askew and you won't end up with a square when you're done. And this time, I'm going to use my handy little guide here. I've set my guide to be 1 inch, which is the spacing that I want my quilting in between each of my rows of stitching. So now, my arm on my walking foot is going to ride on that last row of stitching that I just did. This is going to take a little bit, so don't rush. Take your time so you have nice straight lines. Again, I sewed into my wreath. I'm going to take a stitch or 2 before I exit my wreath. My walking foot guide is on my previous row of stitching. After you get a few rows of stitching done, you'll always have a place to follow. So now that we have our pillow background quilted, remember the pattern says to do this at the end. I thought it'd be a little bit easier to do it now. Once we have this done, we're going to move on to the next part, which is tracing our flowers and leaves. So you're going to take out your pattern, and on your pattern you'll notice that there are reversed templates, and you need to use those. Now you have a couple of different options or ways that you can do applique. I'm going to first teach you the way that your kit shows and requires, but then I'm going to teach you 2 other ways because perhaps you like that way better than using a fusible product. When we do this, there are 2 types of fusible products that I like and that they suggest. The first one is called Heat and Bond. It's usually a lightweight heat and bond that I use. Its drawback is that it doesn't adhere until you put heat to it. So my favorite product that I use most often is called Light Steam-A-Seam 2. You can purchase this in sheets like this package, or you can purchase it in a roll. So you could buy a half yard, a quarter yard, a yard, 2 yards, whatever you need. The reason that this is my favorite product to use is you'll notice that there's paper on both sides. And inside of it, if you were to pull away the paper on either side, your product is sticky. I love that because it allows me to place it onto my fabric, and then once my fabric is adhered to it, by pulling away the other piece of paper, it allows me to place and, let's say, audition where I want that applique to be on my product. So let's use this first to start tracing our pieces. I like to use a mechanical pencil. It tells you to trace on the gridded side. So I'm just going to have this up. I put my Steam-A-Seam 2 on top of my template, and I'm going to go around and I'm going to trace this. So I use a dashed line because when you go to cut this, your scissors can easily connect between your dashes. Another thing about this product and the directions for this kit is it says to leave 5/8 of an inch in between each of your shapes. I don't know about you guys, but I never leave 5/8 of an inch in between my shapes. This is precious paper to me, and so I only leave enough space so that I can cut around it to fuse it to my fabric. So we're going to take this, we're going to cut this out. You'll notice I didn't cut on my tracing lines. I just cut real general, kind of close to it, but not on my tracing lines. No need to be so precise at this point. Now we're going to take this, we're going to look on our directions, and it tells you on your directions which fabric you're going to use for which shape. So you're going to grab the shape and the fabric that it goes to. We're going to pull off the side of the paper that does not have my tracing on it, and we're going to stick it on there. Then we're going to go to an iron and we're going to heat that on there for a few seconds following the manufacturer's directions. I also like to use my applique sheet to put over it so I don't scorch my fabric when I do this part. So now that I have all of my pieces temporarily stuck onto my fabric, I go to my ironing board. I put it on my woolly mat or even just the ironing board. I like to use my applique sheet so I don't scorch my fabric. And I just hold this on. I usually count 1 1,000, 2 1,000. Of course, I do this in my head till about 10 1,000. Take it off. I do that for all of my pieces. Then I go and I sit down and I trim all of my pieces so that I can go to the next step. So using a fusible applique is one way to do applique. Another way is to trace your design onto the dull side of freezer paper. Then you're going to take that design, put it on top of your fabric. This time, please make sure that you have some excess fabric around your edges, about 1/4 of an inch. Take your iron and just iron it on, not a long time, just long enough for that waxy substance that's on the wrong side of your freezer paper to adhere to your fabric. You're just going to take your scissors and you're going to kind of trim around your shape here, leaving about 1/4 of an inch all the way around your template, you don't want to leave much more than 1/4 inch, but don't be too shy either, because we're going to turn this. Once you have it trimmed about like this, you can take a smaller, sharper scissors and cut yourself some little slits in the fabric wherever there's a curve. That will help you turn your fabric onto your piece of freezer paper. Then you're going to use an applique glue and either an awl or what some people call a stylus. And we're going to just put a couple of little drops of applique glue. Don't use a lot of glue, but use enough to hold it. I usually just put a couple of dots on it, on my freezer paper. Then I use my awl or stylus, whatever you want to call this handy little tool. I use it and my fingernails a little bit, and I just fold this over. You'll notice I kind of hold it a little bit for the glue to adhere. So you're just turning this all the way around your piece. So that when you finish with this part, the right side of your template is going to have that perfect flower shape that your template has. Why would you use this? Well, a lot of people use this technique if they like to hand applique. You can also use this technique if you're going to machine applique, but with a really fine thread, or some people even use a monofilament thread, where they're only going to catch the edge of the template so that you really don't see any stitching on it. Another way that you can applique these templates onto your pillow is to kind of create the same look that we just did, but with a little different process. So to do that, I'm taking my fabric, I'm taking this product that's made by Pellon. It washes away when you're done, which is kind of a neat process. I'm putting it on top of the right side of my fabric. I'm then going to take my template pattern and I'm going to put it on top of there. I'm going to put a pin or two in this, and then I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew around the outline of my flower. The process or thought behind this is then I'm going to trim it like I did the others, but then I'm going to turn it right side out, and so I don't have to glue those edges of my applique down like I did in the glued applique process. By sewing and turning, it does that for me. We're going to take this lightweight layer here, which actually dissolves once you wash the quilt, which I think is so cool. The fabric that I'm using it on is right side onto that. Then using my template that I made out of freezer paper, I ironed it on so it would stay in place just long enough for me to sew around it. I'm going to bring it over to my machine. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and the end. And all I'm trying to do is just stitch around this template that I created. All right, now that I've stitched around my flower template, I am done with that piece of freezer paper. I don't need it anymore. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take a nice sharp little scissors. I'm going to trim around my design about 1/4 inch away. So I'm just going to go back and I'm just going to make a few little slits in here just so that it turns easier. Again, do not cut through your stitching. Okay, now on the side where we have that lightweight fabric, we're just going to create a little rip. We're just going to turn this right side out. And then I like to go to the iron and I just press it so it looks all nice and pretty, and so that this additional fabric that will disappear when I wash it isn't visible. So now that we have all of our beautiful flower shapes and leaves and our wreath, we're going to go back to using our original template. You'll notice I also have out my light box. If you don't have one of these, a bright, sunny patio door or window works wonderful. I'm going to take my template. I'm putting it right side down. You may be saying, Cris, why are you doing that? I'm doing that because when I traced my floral ring, I traced it from this side. So I need the reverse of that. So I'm putting it right side down. If you still struggle to see this, even with your light box or a nice sunny day, what I like to do is I take a black Sharpie and using my light box or light source, I trace all the lines that I'm trying to see. The Sharpie just makes them a little bit darker. Then, after I have this on my light box, I'm going to take my applique sheet. Why do I use my applique sheet? Because if we've used light Steam-A-Seam 2, my flowers will stick right to my applique sheet, and then when I use heat, they will fuse together, and I'll be able to peel the whole thing off as one unit. So I'm going to take my wreath, and I'm going to try to line it up according to my little light box here, my pattern on my light box. If you want, take some tape and hold it in place. I frequently do that so that this part doesn't move on me. Now I'm going to use my pattern as my reference, and according to this, I build from the bottom up. So according to this, I need a blue tulip. It's the most bottom of my picture here. So I'm going to pull that off first, and I'm going to stick it on right where the tulip should be. So now that I have my blue tulip down, it looks like my gold large flower is next. The wonderful part about this Steam-A-Seam 2 is what if I make a mistake? Well, that's okay. All I have to do is just lift it off and continue on. Not a problem. We're just going to continue to build our entire wreath of flowers this way. When we're done building it here, we're going to take it over to our ironing board, and we're going to apply some heat, and that will set all of my flowers exactly where I want them. So now that you have your flowers and leaves placed where you want them according to the template, we're going to take our fabric and our applique sheet, we're going to slide it on over to our ironing surface. We can get rid of our light box, our pattern, because we don't need that anymore. And we're going to iron our pieces down. Just be careful. You'll notice my applique sheet is not as big as my floral wreath. So after I iron this half down, I'm going to need to slide my floral part over and iron this half. So as you can tell, I've already done some of the edge stitching around the wreath and around the flowers. I'm just gonna finish these two flowers out so that you can see what I'm doing. I lowered my stitch length to 2.25 on the Bernina. I had originally thought I was gonna go with a larger stitch. I played with a 3.0 and I didn't like the look of it, so I actually took it down a little bit. You'll also notice I have my 1/4 inch foot on here. The reason I'm using that is I love to use this inner guide here as my stitching guide. I just find it works really well. I don't have to think. All I have to do is keep my fabric next to it. So I like to start using my hand wheel. Your hand wheel is not a bad word. All you have to remember is when you do use your hand wheel, always turn it toward you. So I'm just gonna stitch. I'm gonna pull my tails to the back of my fabric when I finish, and I'm just gonna go forward, keeping that cut edge of my flower even with this inner edge of my 57 foot. I love my knee lift when I do things like this. It makes it really simple for me to raise up my foot just a little bit. You'll notice I'm not Speedy Gonzales when I'm doing this. It takes a little patience so that you get it exactly where you want it to be. If my fabric wasn't so thick, when I do this, I would have stabilized. I would put a piece of stabilizer on my back fabric just so that my stitches wouldn't sink in. But I found with this one, I really didn't need to do that because I'm going through the top layer of my pillow, I'm going through batting, and I'm going through that back layer that I put on. I'm done with that one. I'm just gonna cut it so that I have nice long tails. And I'm gonna pull those tails through when I'm done with the next one. I'm gonna pull them down through my back and tie them off. Some people would tell you you don't need to do that. You can use your stitch in place, your securing stitch. I just do it. I don't know. I'm old school. You'll notice the other flower that I left to show you today is the one that has the stitching in the center. Now what I had to remember to do was to trace this on using my light box before I put it on here. But you know what? If you forgot to do that, easiest way around it is grab a piece of tissue paper, trace that design again, put it on top, and just stitch through the tissue paper. But since I remembered to put it on here, I'm going to start at the center, I'm going to work my way out, and then I'm going to stitch around it. I have my stitch length at 2.25 again. So now that we have all of our flowers appliqued down, now is the time that we would embroider the word mother, mom, or whatever form of endearment you use for your mom, if you want to put that on here. If you're going to do that, what I suggest is trace their writing that the pattern gives you onto a piece of tissue paper, pin it in a place where you want it, and then I would use a stem stitch of embroidery to write that out here. I think for the store, we're just gonna leave it blank, and that way we can leave this pillow out for the entire summer versus just Mother's Day. So now that we have the top of our pillow appliqued on, I'm gonna show you how to embroider your phrase or term of endearment for mom. You'll notice I just chose mom. That's what I call my mom. So I took 3 strands of embroidery floss, put a knot in it, I'm going to do a stem stitch. You'll also notice that I traced the company's mom onto tissue paper. I do this because I'm not confident in my own penmanship. I usually like the company's logo better than my own. If you're confident in yours, just take a air erase pen and draw the word mom, mother, whatever term of endearment you would like to use. When stitching through tissue paper or even just stitching directly onto the pillow, we're just going to come up from the back side. When you're doing a stem stitch, you take a stitch, bring your needle up halfway in that distance of your stitch, We're gonna pull it. We're gonna bring the thread back down to us. We're gonna take another stitch about the same length. And again, we come up about halfway in that distance of that stitch. This is called a stem stitch. Some people call it an outline stitch. You can easily Google any embroidery books and they will teach you, give you a very in-depth diagram of how to do this. But basically you're just taking a stitch, coming up halfway into that stitch with your needle. You're always keeping your thread going the same direction. So you'll notice my thread is always down. And you're just going to continue this until you finish your word. When you finish, bring your needle down and tie a knot off in the back. Once you have your embroidery finished, now we're going to square up the pillow to 20.5 by 20.5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a long ruler. I kind of want to measure to see how much fabric I have on each side of my wreath of flowers here. I appear to have more material on this side than this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get those measurements about even. Just going to take my air erase pen and put a little mark. Now I want to be sure that my marks are at 20.5 inches. I'm going to do the same thing with my top and bottom. I just like to try to keep it proportional if possible. All right, let me grab a square. If you have a bigger square at home, this will make your life a little bit easier. But here we have a 12-inch square, so that's what I'm going to work with. I'm going to just cut these two edges so I know what I'm working with. Kind of like when you square up a quilt. You always want to put your corner square in the corner and make those two measurements. We're going to come up here. Now that I have a 20.5 by 20.5 inch square, I'm going to take the backs of my pillow, which I already prepared. Your pattern tells you exactly what length to cut them, and then you'll notice that I turned under twice and I edge stitched this. This is going to go wrong sides together onto the back of my pillow. Now we're going to take the other back half. You'll notice that it overlaps quite a distance. That's what you want. That's called that pocket envelope. That's to hold your pillow form in there. Remember, wrong sides together of your fabric. Okay, so now that we have it pinned, I'm just going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to base this in place so it doesn't move on me. So I changed my stitch length to 3 just for a basting. And just to be sure that I don't see this stitching after my binding's on, I'm going to take about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance instead of a 1/4 inch. And we're just going to go. So now that we have our back of our pillow basted on so it doesn't go anywhere, we're going to put the binding on. You'll notice I already made my binding. Your pattern tells you to cut 2 1/4 inch strips and miter them together. I'm going to sew my binding from the top side because I will hand sew the back side. If you prefer to machine bind, where you use the machine for both attaching it and finishing it, you'll want to make sure that you put your binding on the back at the beginning. All right, so let's make sure we have a long tail when we start. We're just gonna put a pin here to hold it in place as we map this out. I always like to double check or map it out to make sure that I don't end up with a seam in any of my corners. So I'm actually going to, with my fingers, turn it just like I would if I were at the machine. I want to make sure that, oh, see, this is what I'm trying to prevent. If I would have left it where I started, I'd end up with this big bulky seam in the middle, right at my corner. I don't want to do that. Not worth the headache that it'll create later. So I'm gonna just bring mine down a little bit. You could have left more of a tail. Really doesn't matter. We have plenty of binding on this one. So again, I'm just gonna fold it. Make sure that I don't end up with that seam on my corner. I'm gonna do that all the way around my pillow. Once I'm happy with that, then I'm actually going to sew my binding on. Looks like I'm good. This one's a little bit close, but I will miss the seam by just a little bit. So let's go to our machine and put our binding on. You'll notice that I have my walking foot on my machine, and even though my machine has dual feed, I love to attach bindings with my walking foot for a couple of reasons. I think it just flows over the fabric nicely. I also like that there's this little line here for the 1/4 inch seam. I seem to do really well with my walking foot. So remember, when you start putting your binding on, make sure that you backstitch so that it's securely in place. Have the edge of your binding against the edge of your pillow. I also like my walking foot for when I get to the edge of my binding, because there's another little line that if I stitch to that line, having the line even with the edge of my fabric, I know I can just raise my presser foot, turn it, and stitch off my project on a diagonal. Creates that nice diagonal line, which is going to reduce bulk in my binding. So I've stitched off on a diagonal. Now I'm just going to bring my binding up, create that nice diagonal line. We're going to put a pin here so it doesn't move on me, and I'm going to bring my binding strip back in the direction that I'm going to sew, and I put another pin. When I go to resew this time, I'm going to put my finger inside my loop of threads, and I'm going to back stitch on this corner again. That way it's secure, I don't have a gap in my binding, and then I can just take my pins out. They've served their purpose. I'm going to follow that same process on all my corners. So now the way that I join my binding is I need to figure out how much of an overlap I need. You'll notice I left this really long tail here, but it's not that much of a space here. So what I'm going to do to make it a little bit easier on myself is I'm going to shorten this tail up a little bit. I'm going to put a pin near the edge. My top piece of binding, I'm going to see exactly where those two match up. I always put a pin there just so I can see it. I have a 2 1/4 inch binding. So rule says I measure 2 1/4 inches of an overlap. And I'm going to put a pin there because that's where I'm going to match up my binding. Now, I've done this a few times and I realize 2 1/4 inches doesn't work for me. I need it 2 1/8 because otherwise I somehow end up with a little too much. So I'm going to measure 2 1/8. I'm going to put my pin there. I'm going to go through one layer of the fabric and just putting the pin down like that. Now I'm going to unpin the tail that I started with, and I need to match these up just like you did when you made the binding. The pin that I left in is where my cut edge of my previous binding goes. So that it doesn't move on me, I like to put a pin not in the direction I'm sewing, but a pin to hold it in place along the side. I also put a pin along the top, and then I'm going to pin on that diagonal line that we're going to draw. So I just take a couple of pins. I know about where that diagonal line is going to end up, so I put 2 pins in there. Take my small ruler, my air erase marker. You can use a pencil, you'll never see it. And we're going to draw a diagonal line from the corner of this top binding down to where my binding strips meet in the opposite corner. I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch this line, making sure that I back stitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so now that I have that binding strip sewn, I just check to make sure that it's long enough. It's not too long. That's why we didn't cut off this tail yet. It's gonna match. It does match. So now I can cut this tail. I just eyeball it 1/4 inch along that diagonal line. If you're a little big, it's okay. No one's gonna see it. If you have your iron handy, iron that seam open. If you don't, finger press it open and you'll be all right. Take a couple of pins, pin it in place. This is where you can also use clips. You'll notice I have my clips out. I didn't even use them. I tend to be a pin girl, but clips work too for this. All right, we're gonna stitch this closed. And now I have my binding sewn on. I like to go through, clip off these little triangle pieces. Some people don't care, doesn't really matter. I'm gonna now go to my iron, and I like to press my binding up. Once you have those going the direction that you want, I like to flip it over, and now is when I love using my binding clips. I start with my corners, and if this is my top fabric on the right side, it becomes my bottom fabric. I find when I do it that way, I end up with a really nice, crisp, mitered corner. Just use your fingernail to put that fabric in there and get that sharp corner. Then I go to the opposite corner, I do the same thing. And then I just go back. I trim some threads as I go because I don't want them to stick out of my pillow. Take some binding clips and put them on here to hold them in place as I hand sew the binding in place. You can do the same thing if you're machine binding it. Do that to all 4 sides. Finish sewing your binding on, and then you're just going to put your pillow form in here and you'll have a completed pillow when you're done. Hope you enjoyed it. So here's our finished pillow. Well, not really. I still have to go back and hand bind the back side of our binding, but I just wanted to put it together so you could see what it looks like. If you're a person who would like your corners a little bit fuller, here's the trick. Instead of cutting your pillow to 20.5 inches by 20.5 inches, cut it to 19.5 by 19.5. Still use that 20-inch pillow form. It's gonna fill out your pillow a little bit more.